In the heart of West Africa, in a land long tested by fire, a scene unfolded that the world could hardly believe. More than 20 times in less than 3 years, bullets, shadows, and whispers have tried to silence one young soldier. Yet again, the assassin's hand was stayed not by armies of steel, but by a people who chose to stand as walls of flesh and spirit. On that morning in Ouagadougou, the ground itself seemed to echo with a vow: "We may fall, but we shall never kneel." This was no ordinary clash. It was the struggle between centuries of foreign dictate and a new defiance rising in the Sahel. A leader who dares to refuse the script of dependency, a people who choose courage over fear. A continent that remembers its martyrs, Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi, and asks, will history repeat, or will Africa write a different tomorrow? Stay with us. This is not just news. It is the heartbeat of Africa rising. Subscribe and let us walk together in this African revolution so that no voice, no nation, and no elder's prayer is left unheard. The morning in Ouagadougou began with the ordinary rhythm of life. Vendors arranged fruit beneath red clay roofs. School children sang as they walked dusty streets. Farmers arrived on motorbikes with baskets of grain, yet within minutes, the hum of a city turned into the rumble of history. Word spread faster than the Sahel winds: they are coming again. For the people of Burkina Faso, they needs no explanation. Since 2022, when Ibrahim Traoré rose from the ranks of the army to lead the nation, shadows have followed every dawn. Assassins with rifles, infiltrators with poisoned pens, plots written far beyond Africa's borders, more than 20 attempts in less than 3 years. The capital breathes under constant watch, every sunrise haunted by the question, will today be the day they succeed? On this morning, armed men appeared, slipping through side streets that led to the presidential palace. Witnesses later recalled that they carried not only rifles but devices bristling with satellite links, the type of equipment whispered to belong to NATO special operations. This was not a band of amateurs. It was a strike team prepared with precision, funded by hands unseen, and determined to end more than one man's life. Their true target was a dream, the dream of self-determination. Yet, before the palace guards could react, another force moved first. It was not an army in uniform, but the ordinary heartbeat of the nation. A street vendor named Isongo dropped his basket of unsold mangoes and ran toward the sound of danger. Young men abandoned their stalls, women lifted cooking pots as makeshift shields, and the clatter of motorbikes filled the road. What might have been an open path for assassins became, in moments, an improvised barricade. Wooden tables, bicycles, and carts were thrown across the street. The boulevard to the palace was no longer a road, it was a wall built of human will. The palace, guards stunned, watched as citizens surged forward. It was as though the city itself rose in defense. Mothers beat metal pans until the noise echoed across neighborhoods, summoning others. Elders raised their walking sticks like banners of blessing. Within minutes, the crowd was thousands strong. They were unarmed, yet unyielding, declaring that whoever sought to strike at their president must first strike at them. History hung heavily over that moment. People whispered names that are sacred scars: Patrice Lumumba of Congo, Thomas Sankara of this very soil, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Men who dreamed too freely, who dared to say no to foreign dictates, and who were silenced by the bullet. Those memories are etched deep into African consciousness. But this time, the people refused to allow history to play its familiar script. As the assassins advanced, they expected fear. Instead, they found a fortress that no gun could scatter, a fortress made of bodies, voices, and spirit. Mobile phones filmed the confrontation. Videos spread across neighborhoods before the last shadow faded. Cries of, "No one touches our president," rose like thunder, rolling across the capital. The international press would later confirm the incident. AFP reported that the confrontation took place only a few hundred meters from the palace gates. Yet numbers cannot capture the spirit of that hour. A vendor who had never held a rifle stood shoulder to shoulder with students and elders. A mother carrying her infant screamed defiance into the faces of men trained to kill. They risked not only bullets but the wrath of unseen masters determined to break Burkina Faso's resolve. The attackers vanished as quickly as they appeared, slipping back into the shadows. No shots were fired by the army, no barricades were breached. What might have been another name etched into Africa's long list of martyrs ended as a spectacle of resistance. A plot meant to end one life became the hour when thousands declared themselves ready to die. This was more than an attempted assassination. It was an admission. It revealed that sanctions had failed, propaganda had failed, and diplomatic pressure had failed. When every weapon of influence proved powerless, the last resort was the assassin's bullet. But the bullet could not pass, for the people themselves stood in the way. The sun dipped lower that day over Ouagadougou, but the streets did not forget. They remembered that freedom, once defended, can never again be taken lightly. Yet even as the people sang of survival, an unease lingered. If 20 attempts had failed, what might the 21st bring? As the crowd surged into the avenues around the presidential palace, something extraordinary unfolded. There was no army in formation, no armored vehicles rolling out of gates. Instead, there was a people who chose to become the army themselves. Women ululated in piercing cries that danced over the rooftops. Young men pounded drums taken from street corners, the rhythm shaking the very air. Elders lifted their walking sticks like ancestral banners. In that storm of defiance, the assassin's steps faltered. And then, from the balcony of the palace, a figure appeared. He wore no bulletproof vest, he carried no shield of glass. Standing tall, Ibrahim Traoré raised his fist into the Sahel sky. His voice carried over the thousands. Burkina Faso is not afraid of death, only of losing freedom. The words cut through the fear like a blade. For a heartbeat, the crowd was silent, as if the entire capital inhaled at once. Then a roar erupted, so loud that it shook the windows of the palace. "Freedom or death," they answered. Over and over, the chant rolled like thunder. Mothers clutched their children, not to shield them, but to let them witness the moment. For them, it was not the defense of one man, it was the declaration of an entire people. The streets of Ouagadougou became a sea of resolve. Motorbikes revved their engines like war drums. Vendors scattered fruit across the ground, not in panic but to create obstacles. Youth climbed onto rooftops, waving flags red, green, and gold, stitched with the black star of Burkina Faso side by side with the tricolor of Russia. It was not only a defense, it was a proclamation of alliances, a message that the old colonial grip had been broken and replaced with new partnerships that demanded no tribute of sovereignty. The reaction spread beyond borders. In Bamako, Mali, crowds gathered in Independence Square, chanting Traoré's name and declaring that an attack on Burkina Faso was an attack on them all. In Niamey, Niger, journalists proclaimed the plot as an assault against the very heart of the Sahel alliance. Across social media, videos traveled faster than bullets. A fruit seller in Burkina Faso standing in front of an assassin's rifle became a symbol of Africa's refusal to kneel. Internationally, the images were impossible to ignore. Yet where the people saw courage, Western outlets painted shadows. Major French broadcasters labeled the events as instability and dictatorship, framing citizens' mobilization not as love but as manipulation. Commentators in Washington spoke of regional threats and authoritarianism, suggesting that Traoré was clinging to power by orchestrating street theatrics. But on the ground, the narrative was reversed. For ordinary Burkinabe, no speechwriter or general could compel them to throw their bodies in front of rifles. Only love of dignity, of bread, and of their children's tomorrow could do that. The bond between leader and people deepened that day. For decades, Africa had been haunted by a cruel pattern. Charismatic leaders cut down in their youth, dreams buried with them, and nations thrust back into dependency. But in Ouagadougou, history seemed to resist repetition. Traoré's survival was not only physical, it was symbolic. Each failed attempt to erase him made his figure larger, his defiance sharper, his connection to the people stronger. That connection carried into the night. Farmers rode hundreds of kilometers on battered motorbikes to join the crowds guarding the square. Women cooked in the streets, feeding strangers as if they were brothers. Veterans of past revolutions stood with tears in their eyes, declaring on national television, "They killed Sankara because he dreamed of freedom. This time, we will not let history repeat itself." The words, heavy with memory, became a new rallying cry. And yet, beneath the joy, shadows lingered. The assassins had melted back into the city. They had not been captured. Their weapons, their funding, their masters, none had vanished. If anything, the attempt revealed a chilling truth. Enemies of Burkina Faso were prepared to strike again and again, no matter how many times they failed. And for all the cheers that filled the night sky, another question haunted the silence of dawn. If bullets could not break this bond, what new weapon would the enemies of freedom unleash next? The morning after the failed assassination attempt, Ouagadougou awoke to a calm that was anything but peaceful. Markets reopened, children hurried to classrooms, and farmers carried produce to town. On the surface, life seemed to continue. But beneath, the air was thick with the knowledge that the struggle had entered a new chapter. The clash on the palace steps had not ended the war, it had merely shifted its shape. The first impact was economic. Within days, new sanctions were announced. Foreign credit lines were frozen, banks restricted transactions, and prices began to rise. Merchants complained that fuel shipments were delayed, that shelves once filled with imported goods now stood half empty. In another time, such measures might have strangled a small, landlocked nation. But instead of surrender, the people turned inward. Farmers pledged to expand local production. Community leaders repeated a new mantra: consume what we produce what we consume. It was more than survival. It was a declaration of independence, a reminder that dignity often begins with the food on one's table. The second impact was social. Far from paralyzing the population, the attack mobilized them. Women organized night patrols, walking the streets with whistles and drums to guard against intruders. Teachers trained children to recognize strangers and sound the alarm. Young men formed brigades of volunteers, reinforcing neighborhoods with watchful eyes. Elders, recalling decades of coups and betrayals, offered their wisdom to map escape routes and prepare safe havens. Out of fear emerged a new social fabric, woven with vigilance, resilience, and shared duty. Yet the deepest wounds came in the political realm. The assassination attempt revealed not only foreign enemies but hidden betrayals from within. Reports surfaced that confidential files about the nation's uranium reserves had been stolen and carried across borders. Worse still, the suspects were not faceless foreigners but senior officers once sworn to defend the Republic. It was treachery that cut deeper than any bullet. Addressing the nation, Ibrahim Traoré did not shout. He spoke calmly, almost softly, but every word weighed like iron. The strongest enemy is not always the one pointing a gun from outside. Sometimes it is the one smiling inside our own camp. His warning pierced deeply into the national memory. Africa has known too many betrayals, leaders struck down not only by foreign bullets but by hands within their own palaces. The scars of Lumumba, of Sankara, of others unnamed, still haunt the continent. Now the people of Burkina Faso feared the same shadow lingering in their midst. The government responded with tightened measures, surveillance expanded, community watchdogs were empowered. Opposition voices accused the leadership of silencing dissent, while supporters insisted that discipline was essential in a time of war. This paradox defined the hour. Every attack made the bond between leader and people stronger, but it also deepened the country's isolation and hardened its internal atmosphere. And yet, the paradox did not break the spirit. On the contrary, the people interpreted each failed assassination as a testament to destiny. Every plot revealed the desperation of enemies who had tried sanctions, propaganda, and diplomatic pressure all in vain. If the only weapon left was the assassin's bullet, then surely Burkina Faso stood on the right side of history. A telling moment came when an elderly veteran appeared on national television, his hands trembling but his eyes alight. They killed Sankara because he dreamed too early. This time, we will not let history repeat. His words were broadcast across villages, carried into the Sahel winds, repeated by children in classrooms, and by mothers cooking evening meals. The vow became part of daily speech. Never again would Africa surrender its dream to the conspiracies of outsiders or traitors. Still, uncertainty lingered, sanctions tightened like a noose, trade faltered, and whispers of betrayal gnawed at the foundations of trust. People began to ask quietly, how long could a nation endure hunger, betrayal, and siege without breaking? Could unity forged in fire withstand the slow erosion of scarcity? Or would the same strength that had saved Traore on that morning fracture under the weight of hardship? This was not merely the story of a leader surviving bullets, it was the story of a nation being tested by subtler weapons, economic isolation, political suspicion, internal treachery. And in that test lay the greater question. If the strongest enemy hides not across the border but within, what shield can protect a nation's soul? Do you believe unity is stronger than betrayal? Write Africa Rise in the comments if you stand with this vow. Far beyond the streets of Ouagadougou, the failed assassination reverberated through the corridors of global power. In Washington, officials wasted no time. Burkina Faso was placed on a special watch list, justified by phrases like regional security and nuclear safety concerns. To the untrained ear, these words sounded routine. But to those versed in diplomacy, they were red flags, signaling that direct intervention could no longer be ruled out. The State Department froze aid packages and suspended trade arrangements, declaring that the young captain's defiance endangered stability across West Africa. France, once colonial master of this land, responded with sharper edges. Editorials in Parisian newspapers repeated a single refrain: dictatorship, instability, repression. Credit lines were cut, commercial ties restricted, and diplomatic pressure tightened. French broadcasters replayed images of the crowds in Ouagadougou, but not as proof of unity, they framed them as frightened civilians coerced by a military regime. To them, the uprising of flesh and spirit was not courage but chaos. Yet not every capital echoed this chorus. In Moscow, officials condemned the attempt on Ibrahim Traoré's life, declaring that any further assault would be treated as a hostile act against sovereignty itself. Russian commentators framed their support not merely as alliance but as solidarity against neocolonialism, strengthening narratives of Africa rising beyond foreign dictates. Beijing followed suit, offering promises of infrastructure investment and economic partnership with no political strings attached. The most surprising reaction came from Pyongyang. Reports confirmed that 700 North Korean commandos had been dispatched, not only to secure the presidential palace, but to train local brigades in urban defense and counter-drone tactics. Western media denounced this as evidence of authoritarian states tightening their grip in Africa. Yet for the people of Burkina Faso, the arrival of these fighters meant stronger walls against enemies who lurked unseen. Meanwhile, across Africa itself, solidarity spread like wildfire. In Bamako, in Niamey, in Dakar, demonstrators lifted the red-green-gold flags of Burkina Faso beside their own. For them, the attempted assassination was not a local affair. It was a strike at the very heart of the Sahel alliance, the regional front against dependency. Independent journalists called it a warning that Africa's sovereignty was under siege. Diplomatic chambers became battlegrounds. At the United Nations, Western delegations pressed for resolutions condemning Traoré's leadership, while Russian and Chinese representatives vetoed proposals that hinted at intervention. The result was deadlock, a miniature Cold War played out within marble halls. In this clash of narratives, the true stakes were laid bare. For Western capitals, the issue was influence, resources, and keeping Africa in familiar lines of control. For Moscow, Beijing, and their partners, it was about presenting an alternative world order, one where African revolutions could stand without being silenced. And for the people of the Sahel, the meaning was more urgent: survival, dignity, and the right to decide their tomorrow. But as giants circled and headlines multiplied, a deeper question began to loom. If the world has already chosen sides, will Africa be forced to choose between them, or can it carve its own path into the future? As dawn broke over Ouagadougou the day after the attack, the streets seemed calmer, yet the silence was not peace. It was the silence of a nation standing at a crossroads. The failed assassination was not merely an event. It was a mirror reflecting the choices that lay ahead for Burkina Faso and indeed for the continent itself. The first path is one of surrender. Under the tightening grip of sanctions, with aid frozen and credit lines severed, the pressure to bend could become unbearable. To return to dependency would mean reopening doors to foreign military bases, accepting policies drafted in Paris and Washington, and watching the nation's sovereignty traded for temporary relief. For many elders, this is a nightmare. They have already lived decades of subservience disguised as partnership. To walk this path would be to confirm the old saying whispered across Africa: freedom, once lost, is never returned. The second path is resistance. This is the harder road, paved with hunger, sacrifice, and uncertainty. It calls for building new alliances, such as the Sahel Alliance, that promise solidarity without demanding submission. It calls for economic self-reliance, for turning inward to feed and educate the people even when external gates are locked. It calls for vigilance, for recognizing that betrayal may come not only from abroad, but from within. Yet, on this path lies dignity. To resist is to claim ownership of tomorrow, even at the cost of hardship today. In this struggle, Ibrahim Traoré is no longer just a man. He has become a question. Can a young officer from Burkina Faso prove that an African revolution is possible in the 21st century? Can his survival become the precedent that shows the world Africa will no longer accept chains disguised as treaties? His figure has grown larger than life not because he seeks worship, but because the survival of his leadership is tied to the survival of sovereignty itself. For Africa's elders, this moment carries echoes of Sankara, Lumumba, and Gaddafi. They remember the promises cut short, the dreams buried with men too bold for their time. But for the youth, this moment is something different. It feels like a second chance, a fire that cannot be extinguished. The chants of freedom or death are not only echoes of the past but seeds of the future. The choices before Burkina Faso are stark, but the stakes are continental. If this small nation endures, it will blaze a trail that others can follow. If it falls, the message will be equally clear. No African state can stand alone against the weight of global powers. And so, the burden of choice becomes heavier than any weapon aimed at the palace gates. The crowd that stood as a living fortress on that morning gave their answer with their bodies. But the deeper question remains. Unanswered, suspended in the air of every village and city across the continent. Will Africa surrender once more to the chains of yesterday or rise together to write a future unbroken? The echoes of that morning in Ouagadougou will not fade easily. What began as an attempted assassination ended as a declaration: freedom is worth more than life itself. The image of ordinary men and women, vendors, farmers, mothers, children standing as shields before bullets has carved itself into Africa's living memory. It was not merely the defense of one president. It was the defense of a principle that no foreign dictate, no hidden dagger, no economic chain can silence a people once they have chosen to rise. For decades, Africa has carried the scars of its martyrs. Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Muammar Gaddafi, each a life cut short, each a dream smothered before it could take root. But in the survival of Ibrahim Traoré, there is a different message. He has become a sign that history may bend, that the old cycle of hope and betrayal can finally be broken. His words, "We fear not death, only the loss of freedom," have moved beyond the palace balcony. They now belong to every farmer in the fields, every child in the classroom, every elder who once prayed for a day such as this. This struggle is larger than Burkina Faso. It is the heartbeat of an African revolution, the proof that Africa Rising is not a slogan, but a lived reality. The road ahead is fraught with hunger, pressure, and betrayal. Yet it is also filled with the promise of dignity, self-reliance, and sovereignty. Each sacrifice, each night patrol, each empty shelf turned into local produce is a step toward a tomorrow written not in Paris or Washington, but in African hands. So the question returns to you, our viewers, our elders, our brothers and sisters. What future will we choose? Will we allow the scars of betrayal to dictate tomorrow, or will we take this chance to proclaim a continent unbroken? If this story moves something within your chest, do not let it pass in silence. Share it, like it, and subscribe, because the voices of our ancestors were muted too long, and now the future must be spoken aloud. Write your vow in the comments. New Africa. Africa rise. Africa can do it. Let the world see your conviction. For the enemies of freedom, the survival of Ibrahim Traoré is their nightmare. For the people of Burkina Faso, it is their vow. And for Africa, it is the spark that says, "We shall not live in chains, we shall rise in freedom."